So now that we have an idea of what restorative justice is, let's get a better idea of what some of the myths of restorative justice are. Myth number 1. Restorative justice is not necessarily about forgiveness or reconciliation. Certain individuals might believe they are just being pushed into an interaction that has them being forced to forgive the other party. This is not a central focus of restorative justice, and this process is entirely up to the parties involved. That said, it is more common to see restorative justice have more reconciliatory efforts on behalf of the participants due to the nature of the process, and you might see more of this than you might through other avenues of finding justice or reconciliation. But there should be no pressure on behalf of the facilitators towards this end, and forgiveness is not necessary for an interaction through RJ to be considered successful. Myth number 2. Restorative in this case does not mean restoring the previous relationship. The word restorative can imply that restorative justice intends to have the affected parties return to the state of the relationship before the incident at hand had occurred. This is not only impossible in many cases, but not the desired outcome for anyone involved. Imagine, for example, if the harm that's occurred was related to a pattern of domestic abuse. Simply restoring the relationship to the state that existed before the incident would likely not be an ideal resolution. Restorative justice calls for the transformation of a relationship, not the restoration of the relationship to its previous state. Myth number 3. Restorative justice is not mediation. Mediation often suggests a shared responsibility among the parties involved. Participants in the restorative justice process requires the wrongdoer to take responsibility for their harm to those involved and those in the community. Mediation often also uses neutral language towards this end, which might be inappropriate in some cases, and strays away from restorative justice's focus on who did the harming and to whom was the harm done. Myth number 4. Restorative justice is not designed to reduce repeat offenses. Restorative justice frequently is cited for its ability to decrease the number of repeat offenders and lower recidivism rates. But this is not its primary goal. First and foremost, restorative justice practitioners engage in the process because it's the right thing to do for those involved. There is a moral obligation of those in this process to address this harm in the community, regardless of whether or not it lowers recidivism rates. Though it's nice that this process happens to be so good at it. Myth number 5. Restorative justice does not have a set methodology. While there are core tenets persistent among all restorative practices, restorative justice has and will continue to change and adapt to the areas with which it's adopted. Further, restorative justice practices have evolved in many ways over the years, and those engaging in the process are encouraged to find new ways to experiment with what works for them. Myth number 6. Restorative justice is not only for the small cases. It can be easy to shift the focus of restorative justice towards the youth and for small offenses, but restorative justice is designed to assist with more serious offenses as well. This includes hate crimes, domestic, and sexual abuse. Facilitators need to be experienced and properly trained in these more serious cases, but restorative justice is not intended to only help with small incidents, and in many ways, can prove to be more helpful than existing systems with providing justice and resolution for those involved. Myth number 7. Restorative justice is not a replacement for the criminal justice system. Restorative justice practitioners recognize that it is not the answer in all cases. There are some situations which would probably best be handled by a judge and jury, through mediation, or through arbitration. That said, restorative justice believes that currently prevalent systems largely ignore the personal aspects of crimes, and seeks to have a greater balance between restorative justice and traditional forms of justice seeking. Myth number 8. Restorative justice is neither new nor Western in origin. The current push towards restorative practices are indebted to the efforts of native peoples of New Zealand and North America, which have engaged in practices similar to these for decades. These practices reach much farther back than the current state of the discipline might suggest, and in many ways, the community still has much it can learn from those who have engaged in these practices for generations. Finally, myth number 9. Restorative justice is not an alternative to prison. Certainly, restorative justice scholars and practitioners would like to see these practices used to decrease the current prison population. In many ways, the decreased recidivism rates that are a byproduct of this process already aid towards this end. However, restorative justice practices are not necessarily an alternative to prisons, and does recognize that there may be some cases where prison might be necessary. So now that we've discussed some of the myths of restorative justice, our next video will discuss what differentiates it from other areas of the criminal justice system. See you in the next video.